Sarah stared at the spot where her beloved canopy once stood, torn down by the HOA for a made-up reason. But when she uncovered a hidden document, she realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate act. What happened next? It changed everything. But let's start at the beginning. Sarah Miller, a single mother living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Texas, opened her eyes to the harsh reality of a long-awaited morning. Her backyard, a small haven from the relentless Texas sun, stood empty. The bright blue shade sail that had shielded her from the scorching heat for years was gone, replaced with nothing but bare, exposed sky. She took a few steps outside, hoping it was some kind of mistake, but her gaze quickly fell on a small note taped to her door. The Homeowners Association, HOA, had spoken. "The shade sail is non-compliant," the note declared, citing vague reasons about lack of authorization and no further explanation. Her heart sank. That simple piece of fabric had been her escape. The one spot in her busy life where she could sit back, breathe, and briefly forget the daily grind. It had been there through countless mornings of work and school runs, a quiet comfort in the chaos. Now it was gone, and with it, the brief moments of peace she'd come to rely on. Her hands clenched as the anger started to rise. Sarah had done everything by the book. She'd read the HOA guidelines, checked the rules about modifications, and even consulted neighbors to make sure her shade sail was compliant. But now, this faceless group of board members had decided it wasn't. She had followed every step, every rule, yet none of that seemed to matter. It felt personal, like an unjustified strike from an entity that had no real concern for the people it affected. The more she thought about it, the more infuriating it became. The HOA, an invisible force that ruled their lives, had all the power, and yet it seemed to care nothing about the actual people behind those rules. In that moment, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't let this go unanswered. Determined not to let this slide, Sarah dove into the HOA's regulations with a focused, simmering resolve. She spent hours combing through the dense language, meticulously searching for any mention of shade sails or even something remotely related. But after reading page after page of rules about fences, lawns, and paint colors, it became glaringly clear. Nowhere did it explicitly say anything about shade sails. The absence of a clear directive felt like a breach of fairness, a glaring oversight that should have been addressed long ago. Sarah couldn't help but feel as though the HOA had overstepped, enforcing a rule that wasn't even in writing. It was petty, almost as if the board members had nothing better to do than nitpick and enforce irrelevant regulations on a whim. Feeling her frustration deepen, Sarah decided to contact the HOA directly. She dialed their number, hoping for some clarity or an explanation that might at least offer a hint of reason. But the response she got was infuriatingly evasive. The same vague, impersonal language from the note echoed over the phone, with no specifics, no direct answers. She was left with nothing but a frustrating sense of futility, as though the HOA wasn't even trying to resolve the situation, but rather dismissing her concerns like an afterthought. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was a battle, and Sarah wasn't going to lose it without a fight. The lack of transparency only fueled her resolve. They weren't just pushing her around, they were making arbitrary decisions that had real consequences, and it seemed like they weren't interested in offering a fair process. Her next step was clear. She needed to build her case. She began by reaching out to other homeowners, hoping they'd share their experiences with the HOA and offer any advice that could help her. One neighbor, an older man who had been in the neighborhood for years, suggested she check for any changes in the regulations that might have slipped under her radar. The more she dug, the more she realized that this wasn't just about the shade sail. It was about standing up to a system that refused to be held accountable. The breakthrough came when Sarah stumbled across an old, dusty document hidden deep within the HOA's online portal. It was an addendum to the original regulations, buried so far back that most residents would never have thought to look. As she read through it, a small, nearly forgotten section caught her eye, an obscure rule about approved structures for outdoor spaces. And there it was, in fine print, a clause stating that shade sails could only be installed if they adhered to a certain aesthetic standard, one that Sarah had never seen before. Her blood ran cold as she read it. The HOA had quietly added this new requirement without any formal announcement or explanation. Not only had they failed to mention it before, but the aesthetic standards outlined in the addendum were completely arbitrary and impossible to meet. What had once been a simple solution, a way for Sarah to escape the sweltering Texas heat, was now framed as a violation of their ever-shifting, invisible rules. It wasn't just a technicality anymore. It was a blatant attempt to control her space under the guise of community standards. Fury bubbled up inside her. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a calculated oversight, a way for the HOA to force her into compliance without ever giving her the full picture. The idea that they could unilaterally change the rules, then retroactively punish her for a violation that she hadn't even been told about, was infuriating. She wasn't just dealing with an inconvenience anymore. She was fighting for her rights, and it was clear the HOA had no interest in fair play. She sat down and wrote a letter, her fingers moving fast as she carefully cited the hidden clause. She demanded they reinstate her shade sale immediately, calling them out on their deliberate lack of transparency. The old Sarah, the one who felt powerless, was gone. Now she was armed with the truth and a fiery determination to stand her ground. This wasn't a simple complaint anymore. It was a fight for what was right. Weeks drag on. The HOA's silence is deafening, their resistance to Sarah's pleas growing more infuriating with each passing day. But Sarah isn't one to back down. As frustration mounts, she takes a bold step, contacting local news outlets. She shares her story, explaining how an overzealous, unaccountable HOA is trampling on her rights, and the story spreads like wildfire. Soon, other homeowners, some of whom have endured similar treatment, rally behind her. A community of voices, united in their shared frustration, begins to take shape. Sarah's story becomes a symbol of defiance against arbitrary authority, and with it, the pressure on the HOA mounts. The board can no longer hide behind vague regulations and silent treatment. The public eye is on them now, and the tides are beginning to turn. Then, one morning, a letter arrives. This time, it's different. Sarah's heart skips as she reads the first few lines. The board has reviewed your case. She braces herself, uncertain what to expect. But the next sentence changes everything. The HOA has decided to not only reinstall her original shade sail, but to replace it with a brand new one, designed to meet the exact aesthetic standards of the regulations. The new sail, the letter promises, will be even better than the old one. It's a victory, a rare admission of fault, and the first sign that their rigid control over her space has been cracked. Standing in her backyard, Sarah watches as the new shade sail flutters gently in the breeze. The familiar sight brings a wave of satisfaction and relief. This victory isn't just about getting her sail back. It's about proving that even the most powerful organizations can be held accountable. The feeling of empowerment surges within her, a quiet but undeniable strength. For the first time in weeks, Sarah feels like she's won not just a battle, but a war. When armed with knowledge and a resolve to fight, even the biggest injustices can be toppled.